Hi, this is Brandy Dusky, and let's take a look at EDL 901 Module 7 Technology Infrastructure Audit. The first thing we need to do for our infrastructure audit is to formulate a team. My team, I am going to comprise of some district leadership, building leadership, the tech experts that are available, teachers, at least a custodian, and then external stakeholders. So looking a little bit more into the leadership aspect, depending on the size of the district, it might be all of the administration or it might be just a selection. If it's a larger district, I do recommend utilizing building leaders from varying levels so that you get varying perspectives regarding the technology needs in the different sorts of buildings. Looking at the staff, as I mentioned, a technology expert, both those internal tech experts as well as external auditors. So that could be the IT staff that you have on your staff if your district has one. If they don't, it'll be important to select an external IT auditor who has your district's interests in mind as a partner for the audit purposes rather than as a sales representative trying to sell you something. So if you're using an external partner, it'll be important to make sure that you vet that person very specifically for the task. Looking at teachers, very similarly to building administrators, depending on the size of your district, it might be a representative from each building if you're a smaller district, or for a larger districts, it might be just a sample of teachers across varying levels, content areas, and then varying levels of experience, both in education in general, but as well as technology experience. And then in an interview with the technology director in my district, he indicated that it was very helpful to include the head custodian as part of his infrastructure audit, because those custodians know the ins and outs of the buildings like the back of their hand. And so being able to recognize areas of the building that might be better suited for access points or wiring infrastructure, cabling that may or may not be able to be utilized because XYZ is already in place and there's not room. So just making sure that we incorporate custodians into that to get their vast knowledge of the buildings as well. And then when we look into the community, I know it can be scary to invite non-educators to the table, but it's important to keep those stakeholders involved because they are working with the school to partner in making sure that students and our educators are able to grow effectively. So inviting members of the Board of Education, maybe not all members because that creates some stickiness with board meetings. So finding one, maybe two members who could have a viable information to share, as well as site council members. Often there is overlap with site council with the administrators and the teachers, so making sure if site council is involved that it's not from those populations so that you're getting a varying interest. And then asking parents for their involvement in the process will also be important. Once the team is set, they'll need to get started by assessing the current situation and setting goals. Again, in my interview with our technology director, he came back to it multiple times. He just said, really, it all comes down to the end user experience and trying to maintain connectivity and speed while ensuring safety and security. So I felt like that was very important. Jumping into the audit, looking through the audit categories, you can see that there are many facets to consider. Looking into capabilities, district email for students and staff, ensuring that that's available. Recognizing the utility of an online calendar that's user-friendly for individuals needing to schedule or use the capability for due dates and other sorts of things. Ensuring appropriate connectivity and bandwidth. As was mentioned in the Bearden et al. Resource, they're recognizing that bandwidth and connectivity is increasing by 50% each year, and that's not expected to slow down. So just making sure that you are building forward. If you're using Wi-Fi or any other sorts of wireless connection, do you have a plan for monitoring of that? In our district, Wi-Fi connectivity is only available for district devices, so individuals with smartphones and smartwatches, that Wi-Fi password is not readily accessible because they don't want that Wi-Fi connectivity bogged down with personal devices. So the only devices that can access the Wi-Fi network are those that are district owned. And then the devices that will be used in your district, and which ones are they and what purpose are they used for, making sure that the devices that you have selected will meet the needs that you actually have. Looking at protection, we want to look at ensuring that the firewall is set and managed appropriately. Also, conducting regular security assessments to look for weaknesses and breaches. Can your email program detect spam and malicious content? Is that something that's built in, or do you need to monitor that? Ensuring that devices have software that's routinely scanning for viruses and malware, and that it's scanning even when the user is not actively using that function. And then looking to restrict access to confidential information. So, are you, as a district, the administrators, the technology coordinators, able to restrict access to confidential information to keep that information away from people that shouldn't have access to it? I found it actually interesting, and I'm not sure that we have this capability or are using this capability within my district, but the capability to restrict that access even for emails. So an email that needs to stay between an administrator and a specific teacher, that email will be unable to be forwarded on because it's encrypted. So I felt like that was an interesting level of restricted access that I hadn't contemplated before. Recognizing a stable environment. So, are we ensuring the ability to deploy patches remotely to quickly and effectively regain security if there is a breach? And then maintaining control of apps that are downloaded to the district devices. So, that's a level of security that we have in our district right now, is we have to have that admin authentication and ability to download external software and hardware onto our devices. So we can't just go and download anything that might be potentially malicious. Looking at control access, we use a single sign-on system. We use Clever, and that is very helpful, especially for younger students, to have one sign-on that gets them into all of the different information that they need to access. Multi-factor authentication. So this year, that was required in our district for our email. We have to have multi-factor authentication for our email in order for our cybersecurity insurance policy to be in effect. So that was something all staff had to maneuver. The user setup and removal, I found pretty interesting that there are some places that can have automatic setup and then a regular process for removal of accounts that are no longer active. The user setup that we have is relatively quick, but it is not automatic. It must go through the process with our IT department to set up users within the system. And then at times it feels like the removal is swift, but other times those accounts remain active far beyond any time that you would think that they would, like sometimes years, just as an oversight. So making sure that you have control access to the setup and removal of those users. And then restricting peer-to-peer apps that can eat up bandwidth unnecessarily is also important. When we look at secure data, we need to make sure that we have remote monitoring of network services that can preempt any issues of malicious intent. And then looking at the ability for students and staff to be able to sync their documents between their devices and the local network. That can keep documents safe and provide a backup. And it also allows users to be able to go back to an earlier version and edit in case they need to make changes after they've saved. And then some other considerations, just making sure that we're conducting comprehensive assessments that incorporate both internal and external reviews of the data. So we have an internal audit team who's ongoing assessments of the technology infrastructure, but then having external reviews as well so that we can keep an eye on potential weaknesses that we may not recognize in-house. When we're looking at the physical components, ensuring that we have the appropriate cabling to meet the needs of the devices that we are needing to connect to technological services. So really fiber is the highest quote unquote future proof cabling system, but many districts are still using less future proof means, such as like a cat 5 cable or cat 6. And so making sure that if we're going to put the time, effort, and money into the cabling, that we are looking into the future to make sure that we have the physical components that will get us where we need to go. Looking at access points, it's important that we ensure that we are creating access points that allow the most connectivity in the places that we need them to be. So like in our district, pretty much each classroom has its own individual access point because 20 to 30 connections per access point seems to be like the sweet spot. So obviously less is better, but if you're getting more users in one access point, you'll need to look at a bigger access point. So we have multiple access points within our buildings. And then I also included just the technology aspect of building and district level entry. So we use a key card system. Some staff have fobs, but most use a key card. Those can be limited to entrance only during certain times of the day or certain times of the year based on your needs. And then that surveillance piece. So we also have camera systems that we utilize for the surveillance purpose and safety and security. When we are reviewing cost, it's important to keep in mind that technology isn't cheap, and sometimes the biggest expense is unseen. So like I was mentioning, that cabling and the access points, ensuring that you have the backbone, trunk, and core and switches in addition to the cabling that are necessary to meet the needs of your technology purposes within the district. Because if your unseen backbone and cabling isn't sufficient to meet the needs, it doesn't matter what technology you put in place, you're not going to be able to withstand that. And then training, just making sure that staff invest in training in technology, that they are using technology regularly with their instructional methodology, but also ensuring that multiple people are trained in the technology infrastructure as well as supporting that, so that you are avoiding the that one person deep, those issues that are involved when only one person knows what's going on and then that person is no longer available. So making sure that you have some fail safes in place. Looking into current district board policy, our current policy addresses the Children Internet Protection Act, the CIPA, and references handbooks, both student and staff handbooks, that go slightly into more detail regarding technology, but then outlines the acceptable use guidelines in all the areas below, such as what are the prohibitions of acceptable use, what kinds of monitoring will take place, what are the penalties for improper use, what is the use of devices, and what privacy rights do you have when you're using those district devices, as well as copyright, installation of software and hardware, as I mentioned before, and then guidelines on staff online activities and how those will be monitored and or what are the penalties for improper use of that. Looking into some proposed policy changes, I would like to see some additions to board policy that would integrate digital citizenship expectations, especially as technology becomes more and more ingrained into what education looks like. I think making sure that we have some expectations of that digital citizenship and how and when it will be taught to students and what those expectations look like will be important. A little bit more transparency regarding the filter and firewall and what the consequences are for trying to subvert those things, and how that will be followed up on. And then the cyber insurance is not specifically indicated anywhere in board policy, but I think it's important to note that we have that and the things that are covered with that cyber insurance. Like I said, that multi-factor authentication was something that was implemented this year that many staff questioned, why do I need to do this? And when it came down to it, it was because we couldn't get cyber insurance unless all staff were doing that. So again, some of that transparency is just helpful in making sure that all policies are followed. And then some updates to the existing board policies. Within the policy, like I mentioned, there is mention of the handbooks, and the handbooks go into a little bit more detail, especially regarding that cyberbullying, but it's still not very well defined, and what that whole process looks like as far as what it is, what it isn't, how it will be handled, those sorts of things. The discipline and consequence procedures, I do feel like need updated. They're pretty, while I feel like our district policy has been improved to include a lot of things regarding technology, the discipline and consequence procedures are pretty antiquated in that I think our technology has improved and changed many times over since the policy was put in place. And so there are things that are now potential discipline issues that aren't even addressed. And without having that policy to rely on, it's a little bit gray. And then, as others have mentioned, updating the plagiarism policies to include intentional plagiarism, as well as using AI and the Chat GPT, especially for our older students who are submitting documents for assignments that may or may not actually have been written by them, and what that policy and procedure should look like moving forward. And then I included my references here, and those are the references from the module as well as a couple that I added. Thanks for watching.